Hello students, it's Professor Del Russo again, and the last we talked about breaking the ice or raising the topic. That is the transition from the ground rules or narrative practice to the event in question. And we emphasize that you need to be open-ended here. You need to ask open questions. You can't ask questions that have information, questions that might mislead the child. And that's good sound practice. It's best practice. There may be occasions where during the team meeting you conclude that you should ask questions directly almost immediately. Maybe there's something about the child's personality. Maybe there's compelling evidence. There's a video of the molest, or there's other compelling evidence, and it's necessary to be direct immediately. Those are rare cases, but if you do need to be direct immediately, well, then you better be able to explain yourself. You better be able to have an articulable reason for deviating from best practice. And best practice says we need to make sure that we're not suggestive to the child. We need to make sure that we do everything in our power to prevent the child from confabulating. And we talked a little bit about confabulating earlier in this class. In Chapter 5, Professor Poole mentions confabulation. And loosely, that means when a person who's recalling something, a person who's providing a narrative, has other memories that are unrelated to the narrative, unrelated to that memory, intrude upon that memory. Perhaps it's a memory of some other true event, or perhaps it's some fantastic memory, or something in the room, or some reason that the child brings in something that's unrelated to the true memory and integrates that, makes it part of the narrative when it's not a real memory. That's confabulation. So for all of those reasons, we want to be very broad and open-ended when we're questioning a child during the initial transition from ground rules or narrative practice to the event in question. Now, having said that, what do we do if the child does not respond to that kind of prompt? What do we do if the child does not open up or provide any kind of narrative? They don't answer our questions. The foundation that we laid doesn't produce any results. Well, then you have to be a little bit more direct. And Professor Poole suggests, and best practice suggests, that you offer a little bit of information. You may ask a question about the person who you're concerned about. For example, you may say to the child, "Who's Big John? Tell me about Big John." Or, "Did Big John watch you last night when Mom was working? Tell me what happened when Big John was watching you last night." Now, we gave the child some information. In fact, we even gave them a name here. That's not the way it should start out, but if you have to, you might have to bring up a name, for example. Or if you're going to be more direct, you might be more direct in a different way. You might say, "You know what, Daniela? I want to know what happened at the after-school swim club yesterday. Did something happen at the after-school swim club yesterday?" Or, "Daniela, I want to talk to you about what happened in the locker room yesterday. Did something happen in the locker room yesterday?" Now you're being more direct, but you followed a process of being open-ended, and you didn't get any results. And if you are open-ended, if you say to the child, "Tell me about Big John," or "Tell me about the locker room after swim class yesterday," if they begin to give you a narrative or they begin to tell you something, then you must follow up with very open-ended questions. For example, "Tell me more about that." You must do things like include the ignorant interviewer strategy, which we talked about earlier. That is, "You know, Daniela, I wasn't there. I don't know anything about your locker room or your swim club. Tell me everything you remember about what happened," if they began to tell you about something that happened in the locker room. "Tell me more about that. Tell me everything that happened." If you are direct, it is imperative that you follow up with an open-ended prompt and try to be as open-ended as possible until you need to be a bit more direct. So as we've just discussed, you always need to follow up a direct question with an open-ended question. I think we've made that point over and over again. But understanding how to question children and differentiating different question types is an important part of being a forensic interviewer. So you can see on the image I have posted here that we use the hourglass metaphor, the hourglass questioning technique. And if you think in terms of an hourglass, you can see that it is wide at the top and narrow in the middle,
and then it moves progressively wider towards the bottom. So when we're questioning children, we always want to start out with the open invitation to be as wide as possible, as broad as possible. I don't know, I wasn't there. Tell me everything about that. Tell me more about that. That's an open invitation. And an open invitation calls for a narrative response. And by narrative response, we mean the child does most of the talking. We set the stage, and they provide a narration or a narrative. And as we move down the hourglass, we get progressively more direct. The next kind of question is called cued recall, which calls for a cued response. And that's when we try to jog the child's memory. We give them a little bit of information. We try to cue their memory. Think of a cue ball in pool, that white ball that hits the other balls and makes them move. Well, we're trying to cue the child's memory. For example, when we said, "Who's Big John? Tell me everything about Big John." Well, Big John, by introducing him to the query, we are cueing their memory. And we're hoping that Big John results in a cued response, that they now remember about what Big John did, if he did anything, and they provide a narrative. Again, as you move down the hourglass, you get more direct. And sometimes cued recall doesn't work. You may want to use the strategy of option posing. Now, option posing is basically multiple choice questions. So you might say, did something happen in the bedroom, in the living room, or somewhere else? So we're giving them options, and that results in what we call a selected response. So we're being progressively more direct, and we're being progressively more suggestive because we're giving the child the answers in a multiple choice question. One of them is open-ended or something else, but nevertheless, we're giving them options. So we're moving closer to the middle of that hourglass where we're quite direct and suggestive. The next kind of question as we approach the middle of the hourglass, as we get more direct, is a yes-no question. They're generally bad questions, but sometimes you might need to ask a yes-no question. Sometimes you might need to be that direct. And you might say, did Big John come in your room when you were sleeping? That's a yes or no question. It calls for a yes or no response. And we're being much more direct than the open invitation, that's for sure. And lastly, you have the suggestive question, the one that contains the answer, basically. Did Big John come in your room last night and touch you on your body? There may be situations where you need to ask a question that directly, where you need to be that suggestive. You know, maybe the child is in peril. Maybe the child is at risk. Maybe we're not worried so much about a criminal prosecution. We're worried about protecting that child from future harm. Well, we may need to be that direct and that suggestive. And that doesn't mean it's the end of the case. That doesn't mean you don't have a criminal case anymore. Once in a while, you may have to ask a very suggestive question. They should be avoided the best you can. But if you must ask a suggestive question, one that's in the middle of the hourglass, you immediately go to the bottom of the hourglass or the top, however you want to look at it, and you start over. You follow up a direct suggestive question, always with an open-ended invitation. Did Big John touch you on your body last night? Uh-huh. Tell me about that. Tell me more about that. Tell me everything that happened. So this is what we call the hourglass questioning technique. You start wide open and you move progressively towards the middle, and then you go back wide open again if you have to ask a direct question.